Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Two Catholics Thinking, where you get Joe, Cady, and Brenden Bell just kind of breaking open a topic, thinking through it, and talking through some of its implications. So thank you for joining us. Brenden, thanks for being here. What are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about three kind of mindsets or emotions that all Christians should have and kind of the dynamics through it. So we're going to talk about gratitude, hope, and joy, and how we can instill those in our life and through our prayer and through our prayer life, and just how can we grow in these virtues a little bit more.
All right. So let's take these kind of one at a time. Gratitude or an attitude of thankfulness. What does that look like in day-to-day life? This is not like a uniquely Christian concept, right? It's not like just Christians who are grateful. Hopefully.
Yeah. The only Christians are grateful. Everybody else is just really a mean person.
Right. Yeah. So I think that but in a certain sense, I think thankfulness or gratitude kind of points itself to the transcendent, because at some point there's this question of who am I thanking, right? Like, obviously I can thank you, for something that you do that's kind or generous to me. But at the end of the day, having gratitude that I even exist, gratitude for the breath that is in my lungs, gratitude for the sun that's in the sky. Like, at some point there's a question of like, who's the object of my gratitude,
And there's something that I often hear in TVs and movies and stuff where they're like, looking to the universe and being thankful that the universe has some sort of plan for them and stuff. And I'm always bugged by that, because the universe is just a collection of different, objects floating in space. There's no infinite plan to the universe. There's no thankfulness to the universe. So there is definitely something where when I want to be thankful for these transcendent things, like I want to be thankful for a sunset, or I want to be thankful for, the beauty of creation, I have to turn to God and I have to give my thanks to God.
Was it C.S. Lewis who said that, the atheist finds himself in a difficult position when he's thankful and has no one to thank? Was that Lewis?
It sounds like Lewis. I'm pretty sure that's Lewis.
That always struck with me. And again, this idea, we don't want to pretend that people who aren't believers obviously can't be thankful and have genuine gratitude, but it does raise the question of, at the end of the day, who is the source of all the good things that we are grateful for? And I think, at some point we have to arrive at, there must be a good God who created a good world that we can be grateful for. This obviously doesn't mean that there's not difficulties or challenges or suffering or hardships in the world. There certainly is. And I think that's where gratitude and hope come in, right? Like, our gratitude helps us to be more hopeful, even in the face of some of these challenges, even some of these sufferings that we might endure.
And I think that's kind of where it puts, for believers or Christians, we're more compelled to be grateful because we know to whom we are grateful. And so when a Christian isn't grateful, or doesn't express that gratitude, that's we know who we're not being thankful for. And we also have a greater reason for hope, because we know who has ordered everything, and we've seen what God has done in the past, and we're grateful for that. So that gives us hope for the future. Like, the Old Testament prophets, when they would preach that the Israelites would return from the exile, recalled the Exodus. They said, God rescued us from slavery and brought us into the promised land, and we are grateful for that. And that gives us hope that he will bring us back to the land after our exile here in Babylon has ended. And we continue that tradition in the Eucharistic prayers. We list all the things that God has done in the past, and now we're thankful for that and hopeful for the future.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely a difference between hope and just optimism, right? So being hopeful doesn't mean pretending that everything's okay, pretending that there's not dangers or challenges in the world. So I think that's it's important to keep that in mind. And I'm reminded, a saying of Mother Teresa's that has always remained with me, when she says, "Never let anything ever cause you so much sorrow that you forget the joy of the risen Christ." And the reason I like that is because she's not denying the reality of sorrow in the same way that we're not denying the darkness of the crucifixion, right? That's an ugly display of human sinfulness. And yet, Jesus shows that even in the midst of that ugliness, God has something greater. God is able to overcome that in a way that transcends it and gives it life. And so I think that hope is not a naive perspective on the world. It's actually a very honest perspective of the world. It's seeing the world as it is, but knowing that whatever we see before us isn't ultimately the end of the story, that there's something else that is the end of the story.
And I think that the Chesterton has a good point about this when he talks about the virtues of faith, hope, and love. He says they're only virtues when they're in a situation where, I mean, you don't hope when the outcome is assured. It's like if you're watching a football game and you know your team is going to win, you're not hopeful. You're assured of it. Yeah. But when it's the fourth quarter and you're down by 3 touchdowns and you have no chance, if you're hoping at that point, that's a real virtue. That's real hope, because it's a long shot. It's a Hail Mary, that you have that hope in there. And so there's in those challenging moments, hope becomes even more powerful, because, and it's not this naive that, oh, everything's going to work out. I don't have to worry about it. But it's a trust. It's a trust in God and saying, like, no matter what the outcome, I know God's going to bring some good out of it. And I trust that. And I have hope that that's what's going to happen.
And sometimes that can be hard, right? Sometimes it can be very difficult to see how good might come out of a situation. And certainly we don't believe that God wills the bad so that he can bring good about, right? Like, the reality is God made us free beings, and as free beings, we're able to do all sorts of things that are either in conformity with what is good and beautiful and true, or not. And when we fail to, it brings all sorts of darkness and destruction that we shouldn't trivialize or minimize. But I think that the hope comes in when we realize that of all the things that are constantly in flux in our world, and all the things of daily life that change, that we seem to not be able to control, that God is ultimately constant, right? That God, who is the author of life, is constant. That God, who invites us to himself, is constant. God's mercy is constant. And so all these things that change, that seem to disrupt and disorder our lives, we know that there is something that we can stand upon. There's like solid ground that we can stand upon. And I think that's where, again, this idea of thanksgiving and gratitude comes in, where we thank God for being a God who still remains, right? God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is always drawing near to us, always wanting to initiate relationship with us. And that we have a God who we can turn to, a God who reveals himself, and a God who invites us constantly to this friendship. And that's why I think, even in prayer, I think gratitude is in some ways like the heart of prayer, like the perfect beginning place of prayer. Because even my ability to commune with a God through prayer is a gift that I have to be thankful for. Even to have a God who gives me words to express my interior feelings and thoughts and worries is itself a gift of God. So I think gratitude is always an appropriate starting place for prayer.
Yeah, St. Ignatius in the Examen, like, we always think in an examination of conscience, just focus on all your sins. But he says to start with gratitude. And it's okay to have the entire examen of the day, of looking over the day, just being a Thanksgiving. If you don't get any farther than gratitude, that's okay, because we can never be thankful enough to God and recognizing all of the gifts that he's given us throughout the day. Yeah. So gratitude should definitely be the starting place of all of our prayer. I mean, like, I remember reading in the Catechism that said man is a beggar before God. Like, everything we have, we've received from him. So that feeling of gratitude should be the beginning of prayer.
Yeah. And I think that then again leads to hope, in the sense that hope is despite all evidence that might seem to be before me, like, I trust that God's promises are trustworthy, right? That I trust that God is going to follow through to be the God who he says he is. The God who overcomes death by life, who reaches into whatever dark situation we have and brings light to it. That's why even this image of Jesus as the light of the world is the most ancient symbol of the church, right? This light that shines in the darkness. And that's what we're confident. That's what gives us hope, is that there is no darkness that can extinguish light. It's impossible for darkness to put out a light. And so no matter how dark things are, we are grateful for the light, and we keep our eyes fixed on the light, which gives us hope that the darkness won't have the last word.
And I think that that is what leads to joy. Because if I know that God has been there in the past and I'm thankful for what he's done, and if I'm hopeful for the future, I can have joy in the moment, even if the moment is a difficult, challenging one, because like I know that God is going to be faithful because he was always faithful. And and that means that there's a victory around the corner. Like no matter what challenge I'm going through or what struggle I have, there's I know the ending, I know the outcome, and so I have this joy of knowing not only that God will solve everything in the end, but that he's present with me here in the moment. And if it's kind of misery loves company in kind of some ways, is the idea that if you're in a tough situation, you're having a bad day, or you're thinking about like a family vacation that everything goes wrong, if you're with the people that you love, suddenly all of those ridiculous, terrible things can become just a joking kind of, an adventure almost. And so the joy that we have because we know God is with us in this, he's there, we're on this adventure together. And so it overcomes. It doesn't take away the suffering, it doesn't take away the challenges, but it gives an underlying current of joy.
Yeah, it reminds me of Pope Francis in his a recent document of his on holiness in the modern world. He breaks down the Beatitudes, and the Beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, has always kind of struck me as difficult, right? Like what's so blessed about mourning? But he likens it to blessed are those basically who are able to mourn with those who are mourning, right? Like it's good for me to have like a dispensation of compassion that is attentive to the mourning of others, attentive to the suffering of others, and goes and shares in it, right? Goes, accompanies, and comes alongside those who mourn, because those who mourn then will in fact be comforted, because I have a sensitivity to their mourning, I have a sensitivity to their sorrow. And so this idea of joy, again, is not that people who are joyful have no difficulties. They're just the lucky ones that don't have any challenges in life. I know very many people who have faced all sorts of hardship and loss in their life, and yet are still very joyful people, because they know that there's again like a God who's bigger than all of this stuff. And again, all of this can be easier said than done, right? It's not always easy to find the hope or to be a person who embodies joy. But at the end of the day, like, we are people who don't deny the reality of death and suffering, but we know that resurrection comes, right? That new life always comes. And so I even love in the funeral mass, it says that for those who have faith, in death, life is not ended but changed, right? So not even death itself, not even what we see in like our temporal order as like the termination of everything. This is where everything stops. Even for us, nope, it doesn't stop there either, right? God is always able to transcend it. And so joy, again, is this idea of being able to see everything honestly, and to have gratitude that produces hope that leads to joy, that God's got this, and that we have a God who ultimately is good.
I've heard the story that Mother Teresa would have that with her sisters, that if before she would send them out to ministry, she would have them go to prayer, and if they walked out, she's like, no, you don't have joy, go back, go pray. And to build up that joy so that they could bring that joy to those that were in suffering, and to face whatever difficulties, the poorest of the poor, with the joy of Christ. And I think that kind of, in all of these things, with gratitude and hope and joy, that they're virtues that we have to cultivate. We have to practice them, and by doing that, we embody them. We become more in that. And so it's a need to constantly remind ourselves. I know definitely in my own life I have to remind myself to be grateful, to be hopeful, to have joy, because it's very easy to get weighed down by the anxieties of daily life. And so that's why Jesus is always reminding us of that. And we have to practice that. We have to cultivate it. And I think most of the time it's a problem of narrowing our vision. When we're in the difficulties and the challenges, our vision gets narrowed in on just this one problem that I'm facing. Like, my internet's not working, I need to get this project done, or I need to finish my taxes or something. And so I'm focused only on that thing, And by going to prayer and putting ourselves in the presence of the infinite God, we kind of expand our vision away from this narrow focus on this one issue. And not to minimize those things. I mean, these could be major struggles like cancer, death of a loved one. These are not to say that they're small, but we put them in context. And as you said, like even death is not the end according to God's view of things.
Right. Yeah, and this is really what Pope Francis has been calling us to with his document, The Joy of the Gospel, right? That Christians ultimately should have an infectious joy in the world. And it reminds me, Jesus says we are salt and light in the world. And when I think of salt, maybe people don't like, to add a lot of salt to the food, but the whole purpose of salt is it enhances the natural flavor that's already in something. And I think that's what we're called to do. There's goodness and beauty in this world. And as Christians, we're called to go forth and shine a light on that, right? To magnify it. And so I think what this looks like in everyday life is people should ultimately have a better day by encountering us, right? People should be more inclined to gratitude because of their encounter with us. People should be more inclined to hope and more inclined to joy because of their gratitude, or because of their encounter with us. And this is why he says that Christians must go forth in the world, showing and demonstrating to the world that a relationship with the Lord, that fidelity to the gospel, actually produces this great joy. And it doesn't produce this great joy because it takes the troubles away. It just, as you says, puts those troubles and challenges in a larger context to show that they don't define us, they don't define reality, they don't define our experience, and they don't define who we are in relation to God. That God again transcends those. He's bigger than things. And so I think in practical life, the more we practice these virtues, the more we try to embody them and force ourselves to do it, right? You might wake up one morning and think, I'm not struggling finding anything to be grateful for, right? Well, maybe we just reflect on the fact that I'm grateful for the fact that I even have the ability to think about what I'm grateful for, right? Like that we even have an intellect. And the more we force ourselves to do this, we begin to put our body and our will where we want ultimately our mind and our heart to be.
Yeah, Chesterton actually is a great example of that, where he said that he came back into an understanding of God and a thankfulness by saying that mere existence itself was something to be thankful for. Just the fact that I'm here, that I exist, is enough to be thankful. And just that thin thread of thanks really saved him from a place of despair. And so I think even in those times where we are in that space, where we can just be thankful that I woke up this morning, or thankful that I have food on the plate, and I think those opportunities that we have to go and show that thankfulness is even itself something to give thanks for, that God has trusted us with this mission to our brothers and sisters to go out and be witnesses to that joy of the gospel, to be witnesses to the hope that we have within us, to be witnesses to that thanksgiving. I think that is, when you stop and you think about that, the God of all the universe has entrusted me with this mission. That is a tremendous faith that he has in us. So we should have that faith in him.
Yeah. So, practically, right, this is called Two Catholics Thinking, and obviously we want to think through these things, but the whole point of thinking through them is so that it might become formative in the way we live our lives. And I think that, to me, whenever I'd read like books on spirituality and they would kind of get to the practical points, they would always say, okay, well, so what you need to do is first and foremost, you need to pray. And I always be like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to pray. Well, really, what am I supposed to do? And finally it hit me. I was like, the reason every spiritual master recommends prayer is because that's literally the foundation of any adequate response, right? If we don't do that, it's going to be very hard to make progress in any of these other areas. And so I think that cultivating a habit of prayer is really key. And that can be very hard. I grew up in a family that we didn't pray. Like, we just didn't do it. We said grace before dinner, and that was it. That was the only prayers we ever said. And so moving into my adulthood and even my adult life of faith, developing the habit of prayer took a long time. And I would say even only in the last few years have I really gotten to a point where I feel like, all right, I finally hit a stride. That is somewhat because it's just hard to do. But but taking the time and taking the effort to set aside time for prayer, and even starting with simply a prayer of gratitude first, right? Starting that prayer time with what we want to give thanks to God for, and then offering our needs for ourselves and our needs for others up to the Lord. I think the more we can set aside time for prayer, and it's quality, not quantity, right? We don't have to think I need to now go to the Adoration Chapel for an hour every single morning. That might be unreasonable, especially if you've never gone to the Adoration Chapel in your life. But the more I think we can set aside time for prayer, and then be honest with our prayer, right? So I think sometimes we think that we have to like put out like our prayer suit on and our prayer face on before we come to Jesus, so that we can like be the holy Joe who prays. And God says, no, I want the real Joe to pray. And so if I come and I'm frustrated, if I come and I'm scared, if I come and I have anxiety, start with that and offer that to the Lord first, and then God can actually work with our real selves in our real situation.
And I find in my own experience of prayer that there's a flip that happens where if I come in with my fears, my anxieties, my worries, my all of my anger even, and I pour that out before the Lord, at some point I've traded that I walk away with greater peace, greater hope, greater joy. It's an interesting exchange that God does with us. We get the better end of that deal. And so I really say that that's great. And also I think even cultivating it in our just everyday life, like one of the things that I picked up from the seminary that I really like. At first I resisted it because it sounded cheesy and kind of not really good, but I like it now, is just saying thank you, Jesus. Like when something good happens to you in the moment, just instantly say thank you, Jesus. And I liken it to when you teach kids, to say please and thank you. Like you teach them to say it because then they actually think it.
Right.
And it's the same kind of thing. Like the other day with the air conditioning was out in the church and I was working all day, and then I went to the store and I walked into the store and I felt this wave of cool air and I was like, thank you, Jesus. And I was really, truly grateful in that moment, but I wouldn't have recognized it as a grateful thing if I had not cultivated that habit of saying thank you throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool, man. Well, thank you for chatting through this with me. Our hope is that as we kind of engage in these conversations, that maybe there's a nugget or two that becomes something that you take to prayer and take to deeper reflection. But at the end of the day, it's God who produces fruit in our lives, and so we hope that this will, if nothing else, maybe move you to kind of take that next step in your prayer life, to open yourselves up to greater gratitude in your relationship with God, open yourself up to being infused with the hope that comes through being in relationship with the Lord, and that again, all of us as witnesses of the gospel do so with great joy. So thank you guys for taking the time to listen, and we'll see you next time.